check. Hello, hello, hello. Good. Okay. Check. How come there's nothing there? It's very quiet for some reason. Oh. Oh, so you're not getting anything good. Oh. You shouldn't be able to, actually.
No, I can. In the stream, I can.
Oh, well, you shouldn't be able to, actually, right now. Because it's muted. There's nothing actually coming through. Oh, where's that coming? Where and how is that doing that? Why is that mouse dead? Because that's not muted. You're just hearing me through the pulpit mic. Let's try. That'll be much clearer and louder. That should be, oh, no, it's still not loud. Why is it so quiet? That's really weird.
True, I've got this maxed out.
Yeah. It shouldn't, it's got volume there. How come it's so quiet?
Online. You want it online, not mic, right?
I want it online, because mic, then it's like way too loud. Yeah, I'm getting good volume. Let me just listen to it here.
It's not, well, I guess it's maxed out. It should be a lot louder.
Check, check. Check, check. Check. Whew. There's a lot of delay. That's weird. I've got good signal volume here. I can't talk. The delay's too much. Okay. That's weird. There wasn't that much delay yesterday. Check. 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 That's better. Check. 1, 2. 1. 1. No. Let's see. Check. 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 Ooh. Check. 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 Ooh, there it is. Hello. Check. Check. Hello. Hello. Okay, I'll take that off. Then it's more better. But why is that so quiet? It's loud here. check. Okay, so the podium mic is coming through.
Oh. Yeah, now I'm hearing stuff loud and clear. You're breathing? Oh, yeah. My own breathing.
Yeah, now I'm hearing stuff loud and clear.
Yep, that's working.
respectfully acknowledge that we are located on Truett Cemetery Church,
the traveling group gathering place
and meeting grounds for Indigenous peoples.
and I want to welcome you to the 2024 Downey Lecture Series. Whether you are joining us in person or online, we are delighted to have you join us for this evening of learning. For those that don't know me, my name is Bryce Ashlamale, and I am the president here at Ambrose University. So on behalf of our beloved university, the Dean of Theology, Reverend Dr. Rob Snow, and the entire Faculty of Theology who organizes this annual event, welcome to the 2024 Downey Lecture. As we begin, as an act of truth and reconciliation, we would like to acknowledge the land we are on. So please turn your attention to the screen.
We, the learning community of Ambrose University,
Respectfully acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 7 territory.
the traveling route, gathering place,
and meeting grounds for indigenous peoples, including the Siksika Siktapi, comprised of the Siksika, Gaina, Pikani,
Amskapi Bigani First Nations,
the Sutena First Nation, and the Yahe Nakoda, including the Chiniki
Bear Spot, and Good Stony First Nations,
Métis Otipisamok,
and Isikisimu Nunagat.
whose histories, languages, cultures, and traditions continue to influence our vibrant community.
We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today, and those who have gone before us.
we recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude
To those whose territory we reside on or are visiting.
Well, every year, the Faculty of Theology hosts the Downey Lectures. The Downey Lectures are named in honor of Dr. Murray Downey, a beloved teacher and professor at Canadian Bible College, one of the precursor institutions of Ambrose University. Dr. Downey taught for over 30 years, starting in 1941. We are grateful for his legacy in the lives of students, their ministries, and for this annual lectureship named and endowed in his honor. And as you will experience this evening, these lectures are an excellent opportunity to hear from highly esteemed theologians and biblical scholars. This is the second night of 2 lectures, and if you were here last evening, you know the excellent teaching you will experience with us together. You've heard her already last night if you were here, and this morning in chapel if you joined us. But this year's Downey speaker is Dr. Jenny Matheny. Dr. Matheny is Associate Professor of Christian Scriptures at Truett Theological Seminary. Dr. Matheny has taught Biblical and Theological Studies at the undergraduate level and graduate level for 12 years. And before coming to Truett, Jenny served as Associate Professor of Old Testament at Nazarene Theological Seminary and Director of Wynkoop Center for Women in Leadership. She is Consulting Editor for the Stone-Campbell Journal and Co-Chair of Biblical Studies Unit for the Wesleyan Theological Society. We are delighted to have Jenny with us, and if you've spent some time with her, as many of us in this room have, including myself, you will know her not simply as an excellent teacher, but a delight to be around and get to know and visit with, who is just literally curious about every person she meets, and it is contagious. So it is with all the warmness I could muster, and with all the warmness in this room and our Ambrose community, we want to welcome Dr. Matheny. Join me in welcoming her.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome. And again, the warm hospitality of this school and this place. It has been such a delight to get to meet each of you, share with you, learn from you. It's just been a beautiful dialogue in so many ways. Again, it's wonderful to get to share again with you tonight. And we'll continue the overall theme of the lectures, the Old Testament's greatest plot twist, with a deeper dive into Hesed and the Psalms. And again, I'll just use kind of an English translation and say Hesed, because I'm going to invite you to share with me a refrain from a psalm as we get near the end of this lecture, so we can have some participation as we're thinking about this word and this theme and topic tonight. So my aim is to demonstrate how the relational word, Hesed, in the Psalms demonstrates just how special a relationship to the Lord is within the ancient world, to reveal how lament and praise continue to signal back to story, and how Hesed is a word that opens up story with God, a story with hope and heartbreak, grace and grit, missteps and bold steps to continue this relationship, even into mysterious and uncharted futures, even when they feel they have completely blown it. Often, Israel will confess, and then they pray, they lament, and they will boldly proclaim that we want to continue in this relationship as God continues. So although not every psalm contains a detailed title that connects it to a particular event, many psalms poetically recall key moments that open up windows into storied imaginations, whether overtly or through a moment or a portrait of the past. The relational term Hesed opens these windows. And in Book 5 of the Psalms, as well as in other places, the use of Hesed reveals how Israel integrates their story with God, even the mess-ups, to build resilience through poetry that is sung and part of their liturgy, a way to imagine a future, staying connected to God, to remain in relationship, even though the future is a mystery, and to dare to sing a new song. Last night, thank you. Last night, we visited the idea that Hesed is a word that is hard to define, but is a relational word. I put forth the idea that the semantic ambiguity of this term is actually a strength. One of the reasons is that it is best defined through story. Being a relational word, and so considering its use within context enables us to see how it functions, performs even. Similar to the relational term love, it remains abstract until we connect it to story, to certain people and certain situations. Similar to the British-American rock band Foreigner's song, I want to know what love is. I want you to show me. I prefer Mariah Carey's version, but I want to know what Hesed is. Let us see how it is shown through the Old Testament. So in English, it has been translated many ways, including loving kindness, love, covenant love, faithfulness, steadfast love. Many scholars have taken paragraphs to define it, and ultimately, Gordon Clark aptly writes, "Certainly there is no single word that can replace every occurrence of the word Hesed in the Hebrew Bible. It is easier to state the circumstances or to describe such an action than it is to define the word." So as a refresher, how I have chosen to think about this term as loyal, loving kindness that originates in God's nature, embodying both answerability and possibility through anticipated and creative relational endeavors and expressions among God, humanity, and creation. So it is through story we can understand Hesed. And I want to say, yes, Gordon Clark, it's easier to state the circumstances, or may I propose, sing about them? I imagine singing stories through worship in community may unlock ways of knowing that are even more embodied and transformative. For you who are leaders in liturgy and worship, you know this. Isn't it amazing how songs, even today, transport us to special moments in our own stories? What I have found fascinating is that the continual return in memory to a, kind of embarrassing story. This is not like the Facebook or Instagram version of life in the Old Testament. If I were writing a history of my faith, I might be tempted to leave out certain parts where I super messed up. But the golden calf episode in Exodus 32 pops up again in the ancient Israelite Instagram feed quite a lot. So tonight, we'll look at this story that continues to be a moment in Israel's history, a story they return to in prayer, worship, almost like to say, hey, life in exile is really hard, and maybe we weren't perfect, but remember how you, God, responded when we really blew it? I almost wonder if their prayers were something like, stay with me, I'm gonna sing some modern songs. Don't judge me too harshly. I can imagine Israel singing with the late 60s, 70s American rock band Chicago's, hold me now, it's hard for me to say I'm sorry. I just want you to know, after all that we've been through, I will make it up to you, I promise to. So wow, that's a great song of repentance and lament. But not, I know that's pretty bad. But not long after saying sorry, they're singing along with Britney Spears. Oops, I did it again. I worship the false gods. Let fear take control. Oh, baby, baby. Or Pink's, we can learn to love again. Or Canadian Celine Dion. Sometimes I'm frightened, but I'm ready to learn the power of love. I'm not even gonna try to sing that. So you can imagine Israel's playlist, right? And the Psalms are full of these kind of moments of failure and repentance and courageous hope. Words or phrases to remember their Hesed story with the Lord. And Hesed is the foundation of this divine human relationship, and a term that Austin Searles writes captures all of the beneficent divine traits. Contrary to some claims, it is a term that extends far beyond the bounds of the Lord's covenant relationship with Israel. In fact, it is precisely on the matrix of broken covenants within the divine human relationship that illuminates the extraordinary hope in the Lord's self-designation as Hesed. When everything fails and covenants have been broken, when Israel is confused, full of despair and lamenting in exile, they appeal to the Hesed of Yahweh. Israel desires favor, Hesed, beyond what they deserve and what a broken covenant stipulates. So in order to understand how Israel developed the understanding of Hesed as foundational to Yahweh's character and as the basis of their relationship with Yahweh, we first must go back to when the Lord reveals the divine name to Moses. So in the ancient world, names carry meaning. Knowing a God's hidden name was thought to give a person a kind of power and influence over the deity figure. Have you ever known someone's real name that they did not like? You had power over them, but that's a little different. But this reveals the relational intentionality that the Lord chooses to reveal the personal name. The revealing of the divine name gives Moses access to Israel's personal God. Yet the mysterious concealing within the divine name resists the notion that Moses can have power over the Lord. Scholarship abounds around the mysterious name of the divine name, Yahweh, as revealed in Exodus 3:13 through 15. The repeated verbs that make up the divine name, which are often translated, I will be who I will be, or I am who I am, remain mysterious, yet also communicate ongoing presence. Presence and absence within the divine name draws the reader in to observe how this God will act and who this God identifies with. A connection that Mark Scarlatta writes as identity and function, who God is and what God will do. Searles notes that the function of the divine name is understood within the context it is placed in, which means meaning is attached to the divine name as we witness the Lord's character in the midst of the story in which it is embedded. And it is to this story that we now turn. Moses inquires of the Lord's name in Exodus 3:14, but the revelation of the name, Hashem, is preceded by an epitaph that roots Moses to Israel's ancestry and Israel's story. Identity and belonging are important for Moses, as clearly seen in Moses' struggle with his own identity throughout Exodus. His name highlights the ambiguity of identity as one born Hebrew, but raised Egyptian. In Exodus 2, Moses identifies enough with the Hebrews to strike an Egyptian, yet is inquired with hostility by a Hebrew brother the next day. After exiling himself into the desert and assisting Jethro's 7 daughters, they describe Moses to their father as an Egyptian. After marrying Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, their son is named Gershom, because Moses has been a stranger in a foreign land. Names carry understood identity, retrojection, family connections, and they can also imbue projected hopes. This understanding of names and identity informs the revelation of the divine name in Exodus 3. In the famous burning bush scene in Exodus 3, the Lord's personal name may be opaque, but the Lord's relationship with Moses is clear. In Exodus 3:6, the Lord says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The Lord invites Moses into confidence by revealing that he has seen the oppression and has heard Israel's great cry and is revealing the divine self to rescue them. It is as if the Lord is saying to Moses that the Lord sees what Moses sees, is with Moses, and reminds Moses that he is part of the people of Israel in this struggle, even within Moses' struggle of complex identity. What Moses had hoped to do in a limited way earlier will become even greater calling through this theophany, this encounter with God. So Moses will attempt to stand up for one Hebrew and then emerge as the leader of the Exodus, joining with a great plan of redemption that has been the Lord's intention all along. Moses will continue to embrace his identity as he inquires about the Lord's name. As Moses is invited within the theophany to partner in the Lord's miraculous ways in the world, name is tied to identity. The name of the Lord will become clearer as the story progresses, who the Lord is and what the Lord will do. Yahweh's relational presence becomes even more unveiled throughout the story. So as this story progresses, this relationship and connection to Hesed takes a unique and powerful turn after key moments of failure. And this will be one major plot twist. So key stories begin with God initiating creative activity that appears to come to an abrupt end. Yet the Lord enters the marred moment with surprising grace. For Adam and Eve, they are clothed by God after feeling the shame of their decisions. Moses intervenes on behalf of Israel in Exodus 32, asking for the Lord to forgive Israel, even offering his own life for them. The identity-forming story that the Lord draws Israel back to is that the Lord brought them out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. In Moses' last sermon, he reminds Israel to make this story their own story for the next generation. Israel is to continue to let this story shape their identity with each new generation. The first story becomes the story of each generation as they are taught to reframe it. We were slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand in Deuteronomy 6. So here in Exodus, this created idolatrous golden calf image they have made is described as the initiator of the identity-forming story. Aaron proclaims, "This is your God, O Israel, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you out from the land of Egypt." The Lord is not happy with this creation of the golden calf. Strong emotion is connected to core covenant values. Moses will intercede and make a powerful appeal, reminding the Lord that they are the Lord's people, the Segulah. The Lord's reputation or name will be at stake among the nations, and Moses shares that the Lord has been part of their story for generations, extending back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. There are still promises to be fulfilled. The Lord hears Moses' plea and acts. The Lord instructs Moses to chisel out 2 new tablets and return to Mount Sinai. When Moses does this, the Lord came down in the cloud and proclaimed his name, Yahweh. In Exodus 34:5, from the mouth of the Lord declares his very name. This scene where the Lord proclaims his name through Moses has been described as the climax of God's revelation and the fullest self-disclosure of Yahweh in the Old Testament. This statement has been referred to as the grace formula. Walter Brueggemann describes that this list of adjectives merit the label credo, a way to suggest that this is their statement of beliefs. In this list of adjective attributes, Brueggemann writes, the only term used more than once is Hesed, suggesting that this term receives special accent. So let's read it. Then he called out, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, a God patient and abounding in Hesed and truth, keeper of Hesed to thousands, forgiver of iniquity, transgressions and sin. Yet he does not leave wrongdoing unpunished, one who repays the sin of parents upon children and their children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Research has recognized that the forgiveness in these parallel lines outweighs punishment. The golden calf blunder deserves punishment, yet Moses intercedes and the Lord forgives, and this forgiveness surpasses expectations. The fullness of Yahweh's Hesed is realized not only in the offer of forgiveness, but in the context of punishment as well. Forgiveness and mercy outweigh judgment time and time again. Even so, this does not always settle the uneasiness of the ending. Brent Strawn opens up a close reading of these verses with an eye to the poetics within these lines and suggests that the poetic density of these lines influence one another and that these attributes heap up, in a sense revealing the poetic artistry. And he writes, divine benevolence is even more extensive than actually is typically recognized. Within the Lord's self-designation, it becomes evident that Hesed is one of the Lord's greatest self-identifying attributes. Yahweh will continue to reveal through story the expansive grace offered to Israel during moments of unfaithfulness and forgetfulness. What becomes apparent is that the Lord and humanity have the most exceptional divine relationship witnessed in the entire ancient Near East. As the pages of the Torah turn and Israel continues to blunder, it becomes clear that the Lord desires Hesed, not sacrifice. We see that in Hosea 6:6. After relational rupture and repair and unfaithfulness on Israel's part, the Lord continues to desire relationship, calling those far away to return home. The Lord's defining attribute is Hesed. Yahweh forgives based on Hesed and is the one who keeps and abounds with Hesed. Yahweh also is celebrated as one who keeps Hesed for 1,000 generations. The abounding Hesed of Yahweh clearly extends beyond the limits and expectations required of a covenant and will erupt in the Psalms after covenants have been broken and relationship remains. So this golden calf story is one of the stories that Israel recalls when they worship. We will look at Lament generally and then work through Psalms 103 and 106 tonight, where I'll invite you to participate in a refrain in Psalm 136 near the end. So the Psalms contain the most occurrences of Hesed, and this reveals its importance for the community as a voice of witness, remembrance, petition, and hope for the future. The abundant use of it in the Psalms liturgy reinforces the relational component of Hesed as one that deeply shapes the identity and formation of Israel before and after exile. Psalms' use of Hesed provides these moments that recollect the stories of Israel's past, whereby they can fill in the gaps as they recall and reimagine through storied liturgy a hope-filled future after the trauma of exile. In the Hebrew Bible, Hesed occurs with the greatest frequency in the Psalms, erupting around 127 times and through each genre of the Psalms. Many Psalms recount Israel's story, revealing a didactic purpose, one that informs and shapes the community for their future. Because the Psalms are the community's voice to the Lord, the occurrence and function of Hesed in the Psalms illuminates its importance as the foundation of relationship through praise and lament. Lament Psalms appeal to the Lord's Hesed as the foundation of relationship, highlighting boldness within the human-divine relationship and the significance of Hesed within this relationship. Because of Yahweh's Hesed, the psalmist can declare that they can enter the Lord's house for worship, find salvation, be remembered after failure, and have the audacity to boldly lament for the Lord to wake up and help them, from Psalm 44:26. So while focusing on lament, I will trace the use of Hesed through key psalms to highlight how the relational seed forms the foundation of Israel's relationship with the Lord and reveals a unique relationship between Israel and the Lord in the lament within its ancient Near Eastern context, and also how it connects to Israel's past stories and, when rehearsed through liturgy, provides hope in the present, and also moves into a focus on relationship, including yet beyond the bounds of covenant, especially in books 4 and 5 of the Psalms. So in a culture like ours today that often wants to shy away from the painful realities of the lived human experience, the Psalms unapologetically keep room at the table for all of them, without reservation, pun intended. In doing so, they also inspire hope that even in the most difficult and painful rhetoric, the Lord will remain in relationship with humanity because of Yahweh's Hesed. It is difficult to imagine many human relationships where someone can continue to be open, as the psalmist, dare I say, sing and pray, unorthodox theology, because this is how life really feels, and expect the other, God, to stay at the table. It is on the basis of the Lord's Hesed that Israel and all of humanity can boldly and vulnerably pray the whole of life and the whole of emotions. So when looking at the diversity of genres and voices within the Psalms, one may ask, do the Psalms follow enough of a storyline to contribute a theological vision or voice? Although challenging, many respond, yes. Janine Brown, along with others, proposed that non-narrative genres assume stories. Thus, the Psalms contain story, even though some appear more ambiguous if no superscription is attached. The ambiguity enables worshipers to connect to the poetry in meaningful ways. One can imagine how the individual lament psalms on illness and injustice were prayed and sung by households, house of the father, house of the mother, in an ancient time. Perhaps desperate families found comfort knowing that these psalms were sung by ancestors within the faith community, sung and prayed by families for centuries. The psalms are relational in nature and feature the community's voice to the Lord. Through the poetry of the psalms, memory through liturgy and worship has the potential to ignite story through poetic moments and portraits. Although the psalms have been described as non-narrative due to its form and structure, the work of my colleague at Truett, Rebecca Poe-Hayes, reveals how story is embedded within the Psalter and can have communicative power through these moments and portraits. Gunkel helped classify the Psalms under 5 main genres. We have hymn, communal, complaint, lament psalms, royal psalms, individual complaint, and individual thanksgiving. Walter Brueggemann has been helpful in identifying the function of the Psalms that connect with modern readers and communities. Brueggemann uses the 3 broad categories for the Psalms: Psalms of orientation, Psalms of disorientation, and Psalms of new orientation. And Hesed is found throughout all these genres. The Psalms have also been described by William Bellinger as a grammar of faith, as they bear testimony to Israel's core faith descriptions and teach us the art and honesty of lament. In a fascinating interview with Fuller Seminary on the Psalms and art, pastor-scholar Eugene Peterson and musician Bono from the band U2 discuss the influence of Psalms on the shaping of our lives. As a pastor, Peter translated Psalms for people to help them to pray. On praying the Psalms, he says, praying wasn't being nice before God. Psalms are not pretty. They're not nice, but they're honest. We are trying for honesty. One of the ways to navigate these honest places is through metaphor, and the Psalms are full of metaphors. As a 12-year-old boy, Peterson commented on how he attempted to read the Psalms and found them confusing, yet was learning what a metaphor was through the experience, even though he didn't know the word for metaphor. For Peterson, metaphor became an important tool for honesty. I learned what a metaphor is, not by knowing the name metaphor, but by observing what's going on in the Psalms. The Psalms showed me that imagination was a way to get inside the truth. For Bono, these Psalms have this rawness, he says, this brutal honesty. And whether David is the one writing it or not, he says it doesn't matter. The psalmist is brutally honest about the explosive joy he is feeling and the deep sorrow or confusion. This is what sets the Psalms apart for me, he says. Bono describes the importance for art and honesty as well when he comments, why do we need art? The only way we can approach God is if we are honest through metaphor, through symbol. Art becomes essential, not decorative. One of his criticisms about many faith communities, he says, is a lack of honesty. Bono suggests, write a song about your bad marriage, about the government. I'd love to see more realism in art and music. In many ways, the relationship between Israel and Yahweh could be depicted as a bad marriage. Yet because of the Hesed of Yahweh, Israel is able to be honest, speak to places of joy and pain, to remember their story, and dare to hope and to sing a new song. Lament enables a community to process pain honestly. One fascinating aspect of the Psalms is that most of the Psalms belong to the category of lament, even though the book is called Praises. And lament follows a typical pattern with 5 key components: address, then you have the lament or complaint, a request for help, an expression of trust, and a vow of praise. Most of the individual laments follow this pattern, though communal laments are different. One distinction is that the individual laments use the first person singular, I, me, while communal laments use the plural, we, us. In addition, in communal laments, sometimes trace God's saving acts through Israel's history, reminders of their story as an expression of trust. One important thing to remember, though, is that even though it's an individual lament, the I, me, they were also part of a community liturgy. So personal, but also within community. One example is in Psalm 31:1, gives you an example of an individual. In you, Lord, I take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. And then in Psalm 44:20 through 26, we have more of this communal lament. If we had forgotten the name of our God or spread out our hands to a foreign God, would not God have discovered it, since he knows the secrets of the heart? Yet for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. Awake, Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? We are brought down to the dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up and help us. Rescue us because of your Hesed, or your unfailing love. Can you guess how many Psalms in the book of Psalms are laments? More than a third of the Psalms are lament. Here in this next slide, I have listed all of the Psalms with the word Hesed in them. Roughly more than 5, less than 1 million. And so we'll go ahead and look at that slide. You can see all of the Psalms that have that term in there. There you go. And then what I found interesting as I was kind of looking through these Psalms, next is a slide that has all of the ones that are lament, that are in the color. So as I've mentioned, lament is not a unique genre within the Old Testament, yet it does contain different elements that illuminate how the use of Hesed in lament contributes to the unique aspect of relationship between Yahweh and humanity. In comparative study of biblical lament with Egyptian, Ugaritic, Hittite, Mesopotamian, and even a Sumerian lament, Mae Young, her work, and she's associate professor of biblical studies at Taylor University in Indiana, and a friend of mine. Also, she has a new book coming out, so be on the lookout in January. It's called Recovering Biblical Lament with IVP Academic. But Young, in dialogue with the work of Carlene Mondalfo, details key similarities and differences between these ancient texts and the laments in the Old Testament. Similarities include components such as the types of laments, like a lament for an illness, distress, injustice. Vocabulary and themes are similar: praises, petition to divine beings, city laments. Young notes that Mesopotamian laments are the closest in comparison to other ancient Near Eastern laments. The differences, she writes, though, can be summed up in the following two perspectives. The first, how ancient Near Eastern people viewed the relationship between human beings and the divine, and how their prayers functioned. So as far as how these differences contribute to the key relational aspect, biblical laments are different and reveal a closer relationship and confidence in approaching the Lord. In the surrounding ancient Near Eastern neighbors, as example of this distance in laments, it's revealed in how the worshiper will introduce themselves and give extensive praise to curry favor with the gods. Young explains, intercession from the other gods on behalf of the praying person was thought to help secure favor with other gods in the context of the hierarchy that existed. It was not enough to be in harmony with one's personal God. One needed help from the other gods to ensure overall well-being. The sheer number of gods and the complexity related to the system contributed to the sense of distance when approaching the divine. They also felt the need to distance themselves from the sins of their forefathers, to dispel any doubt about their innocence. These steps were taken to help ensure that they would receive a positive outcome from the gods they were praying to. Furthermore, in Akkadian prayers, we find extensive introduction of the worshiper, which sometimes would take up to half the prayer. In contrast, biblical lament psalms, there can be brief opening, just using the divine name, Yahweh, and an additional personal description such as my deliverer, my rock, my God. Another difference in the psalmists in the Hebrew Bible is that they're free to acknowledge personal sin and the sins of the family, as you see with referring back to those certain stories, directly to the Lord without any mediators. Whereas in Egyptian and Mesopotamian laments, a stance of ignorance is taken when it comes to confessing sin, but for different reasons connected to their views of the afterlife, whether they would not want to, offend the gods, like Mesopotamian, or the accepted belief of the order of things, of justice, and maybe judgment waiting in the afterlife in Egyptian prayers. Other issues include the need to ask for intervention from household gods to intervene on behalf to the higher gods. But for Israel, they just speak directly to the Lord. Another interesting point of difference is that in the Babylonian, Canaanite, and Egyptian prayers, corporate praise is often connected to petition and not to the acts of gods within their history. And in Sumerian and Babylonian laments, they reveal a transactional aspect. They include sacrifice, gifts to appease, gain favor with the gods, emphasizing this transactional relationship. Biblical laments, however, are not based on transactional relationship. In the Psalms and prophetic texts like Hosea 6:6, it becomes evident that the Lord does not function in this transactional way and is invested in relationship. Psalm 40, 6-7 recounts that the Lord does not desire sacrifice and tributes, burnt offerings and sin offerings. Psalm 51 speaks to an appeal for forgiveness because of the Lord's Hesed. And this psalm, as many of you are familiar with, is connected to the David and Bathsheba story. In Psalm 51, 15-17, the psalmist declares, "For you take no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give you a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit and a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise." Psalm 51 is also considered a penitential psalm. 7 psalms have this designation, and they're different from the Sumerian and Babylonian petitional prayers connected to ritual, specific instruction, with this purpose to appease an angry deity. The biblical penitential psalms address personal sin through lament, which highlights the unique aspect of the personal relationship between the psalmist and Yahweh. For Israel, a key component to their laments and praise is to recount the acts of Yahweh within their history, even to describe how Yahweh has forgiven them in key moments. So to summarize, many laments address the Lord personally, complain honestly, and recount their story with the Lord. With this in mind, Israel's unique relationship with the Lord can be further characterized by how Hesed functions through the lament psalms. Hesed is often appealed to on the basis of relationship. The Lord has dealt Hesed with them in the past, and so the psalmist prays that this will continue. So similar to a memory being recalled, I suggest that Hesed, as a seed, germinates within the worshiper's informed imagination through story, recalling the Lord's past faithfulness, forgiveness, and compassion in order to inspire hope for them in this future, whatever the current context may hold. So as a window into the past, recounting the Lord's Hesed flourishes through key examples in the Psalms, often recapitulating God's grand acts of redemption through the relational lens of Hesed. This semantically ambiguous term is filled up with examples from history, often from key moments such as the Exodus, regularly reimagined through poetry, and these recollections serve as compelling evidence to provide the community with hope that the Lord will continue to remember Hesed, even though the community has broken covenant and has not been faithful. Hesed is rooted in story through memory. In Psalm 98 of Book 4, it contains 2 praise psalms that start off with this vision of a new song to sing. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord all the earth. Sing to the Lord, praise his name. Proclaim his salvation day after day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous deeds among the peoples. Psalm 96 and 98 are songs of praise that declare that the Lord reigns and the Lord is king over not only humanity, but all of creation. Creation comes alive with vibrant anthropomorphic imagery as mountains and rivers are given human characteristics. The rivers become alive as they clap their hands, and the mountains sing together for joy, and the heavens rejoice. Because Psalm 98 does not have a superscription, this lack of a historical reference enables the psalmist to not only look to the past, but into the future. So one reason for this vision, it involves salvation and righteousness being made known to the nations. And this is because the Lord has remembered, Zachar, his Hesed, 98:3. The second poetic line reveals that what is also remembered is the Lord's faithfulness to Israel. Hesed functions in this psalm as a significant reason for praise and salvation for the nations. Psalm 103 and 106 sing of the Lord's Hesed through an informed imagination, recalling Israel's story through narrative, moments, and portraits. In Psalm 103, which will be up on the next slide, Hesed is found 4 times and remember once. In Psalm 106, Hesed occurs 3 times and remember 3 times. Hesed as a seed flourishes through song as the psalmist laments in Psalm 103 and praises in Psalm 106. So in Psalm 103, Hesed is recalled through the poet's song as an appeal and a reminder that even though the days for humanity are fleeting like grass, the Hesed of the Lord is forever. Relationship through the metaphor of family is used to express that the Lord will not forget his children. The Lord works vindication and justice for all who are oppressed. He made known his ways to Moses, his acts to the people of Israel. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in Hesed. He will not always accuse, nor will his anger be forever. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. For as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is his Hesed towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, as far he removes our transgressions from us. As a father has compassion for his children, so the Lord has compassion for those who fear him. For he knows how we are made. He remembers that we are dust. In this relational metaphor, the Lord gives intimacy, understanding, forgiveness, and Hesed. Psalm 103 is a lament psalm that recalls Sinai and the golden calf incident by using language from the Lord's self-designation, the divine list of attributes that we find from Exodus 34. And verse 8 is the center of this psalm, quoting from this grace formula, right, that we saw earlier. So Psalm 106 is a lament psalm, rich in intertextual citations from the Torah and the prophets. So we can go ahead and turn to the next slide. Along with Psalm 104, this psalm illustrates the importance of story through poetry. As the final psalm of Book 4, it recounts key moments and themes through Israel's story, including the following: the sojourn in Egypt, the Sea of Reeds. We have the golden calf episode, manna in the wilderness. Even Joseph, imprisoned, released, becoming ruler of Egypt. There we have our plot twist, right? The sojourn in Egypt, wonders performed. There's wilderness stories in this psalm, the Lord's presence through cloud and fire, recollection of the Exodus offense, the name of the Lord, the name in 106:4 revealing that the covenant promise is connected to the Lord's name, to relationship, and to story. Recounts of remembering and forgetting weave through this psalm. There's a plea for the Lord to remember the psalmist, a call for the people to remember the Lord's deeds, a lament for ancestors not remembering the Lord's deeds in Egypt, the wilderness sojourn, forgetting the deeds of Yahweh. The psalmist recalls when the Lord remembered them in their distress and remembers his covenant and shows mercy because of the abundance of his Hesed. In sum, Psalm 106 provides an excellent example of how Book 4 engages deeply with the Exodus traditions as an identity-forming story that beckons for the community to remember the Lord's deeds and the Lord's identity as Hesed, and that the Lord will not forget them in exile, as they were not forgotten in Egypt. Even though they struggled to remember the Lord, it becomes clear that it is not about merit that the Psalms, that God's people are invited to participate. It is because of God's Hesed. So when our family moved to Vancouver to go on to graduate studies at Regent College, I remember selling like almost all of our possessions. Our kids were really young at the time. Our daughter was 3 and our son was 10 months old. And for some reason, one of the things that was hardest for me to let go of was our son's crib. There was something about selling his little bed that encompassed all we were letting go of. This saying yes to God to this adventure, but I don't think I could process it all at the time. His crib was where I could focus my grief. When we moved there, it was wonderful and hard for all of the reasons I imagine many of us have experienced as well. I was a little grumpy at times, to be honest. I was not aware that this move included me going to school at the time, the following spring. So even though this move was like for my husband, I laugh at how it actually was for everyone in the family. That fall semester, though, was hard. In fact, I kept my passport in my purse the entire year, just knowing that I could leave at any moment. I never did, but just knowing I could. What a faith story. But before we left the States, I remember praying specifically for a crib and mattress. We made the big move, and my husband began classes. A few weeks went by. I was on the struggle bus. Needless to say, I was having a really bad day, trying to keep track of my two little kiddos as we walked through the atrium of Regent College to meet my husband, maybe for chapel. I can't remember the details. And there on the board of announcements was a big sign that said free crib and mattress. And I just teared up. I forgot I was praying for that. I was just getting used to this portable playpen life for my son. And I just saw that, and I knew it was for me, so I just ripped it down. And this represented for me a moment of feeling remembered and seen by God, even though I forgot to keep praying for that. I forgot, but God did not forget. I have reflected on this story many times as I consider God's people on the move so much, then and now. Their prayers, what might be remembered, what might be forgotten, and even in those places, how God does not forget, but remembers for them. Minds and memories are fragile, and I am grateful that God's Hesed can hold humanity's fragility, and how the Psalms point us to God's steadfast Hesed in so many relatable moments. So the final Hallel Psalm, 146 through 150 in Book 5, concludes the Psalter with a call to praise the Lord, the one who reigns as true King. This universal and cosmic scope brings hope for a community under Persian rule. These psalms are community songs of becoming as they remember the Lord's Hesed. So although the Psalter ends in exuberant praise, there are voices of both praise and lament throughout the Psalter that reflect a more lived reality for a community in exile, and even, I would contend, our lives today. William Bellinger highlights this tension. He says, the movement is not so much lament to praise, but lament and praise. The entire Psalter is rich in praise and lament, holding out hope for the Hesed of Yahweh. Psalm 136 recounts with a refrain in all 26 verses that God's Hesed endures forever. So in this next slide, I'm going to invite you to talk back to me. So what I'm going to do is I will read the first part of we're not going to do all the verses, but I'll read the first part, and then what I want you to do, I'll point to you, and I want you to say back to me, his Hesed endures forever. All right, you think we can do this? All right, let's do this. All right, Psalm 136:1. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His Hesed endures forever. In him who alone does great wonders and endures forever. In him who divided the Reed Sea asunder, his Hesed endures forever. To him who led his people through the wilderness, his Hesed endures forever. We got a few more. He remembered us in our low estate. His Hesed endures forever. And freed us from our enemies. His Hesed endures forever. He gives food to every creature. His Hesed endures forever. Give thanks to the God of heaven. His Hesed endures forever. Thank you for joining me. Praise the Lord. So this seed, this Hesed, continues to emerge through lament and praise as Israel remembers their story, recalling the plot twists, and continues to keep hope in Hesed as active participants in this dialogue of becoming. So in conclusion, Hesed occurs in every genre of the Psalms, demonstrating its significance in Israel's communal life of worship and shaping after trauma. In exile and beyond, what continues to emerge is the importance of continued relationship with Yahweh. Hesed is not only the relational foundation of God's relationship with humanity, it continues to be a significant place of appeal for sustaining relationship and reimagining life as a people of God after trauma, voicing honest lament and praise together, and daring to sing a new song. This new song will continue to inhabit the entire story. It contains refrains from the old stories, and also, as my colleague Rebecca Pohays writes, reflects the work of trauma, healing, and resilience as it reframes narratives. The new song that was voiced through communal prayers facilitate the process of healing from past traumas and building the resilience to survive future ones. So the Psalms teach us that the whole story is important for formation, identity, and becoming. Scholar-musician Michael Card describes Hesed as a deep vestigial part of the image of God in us. At even the darkest moments of our lives, when Hesed seems most distant and least eternal, we find it somewhere in ourselves to sing about the reality of it, the eternality of it, or even the momentary abundance of it. This explains why the vast majority of the references that contain the word Hesed, even outside the Psalter, are sung or occur in poems. Perhaps poets like Card and Bono can help us grasp the depths and heights of Yahweh's Hesed, a Hesed that can be imaged through us as image bearers to be earth and people keepers. Psalm 40 boldly praises the multivalence of the Lord's Hesed, along with lamenting and waiting and expectation that a new song is dawning, both internally and externally. Psalm 40:11 states, "The Lord will send his Hesed by day, his song will be with me in the night, a prayer to the God of my life." Psalm 40:11. Inspired by Psalm 40, you too put the words of this psalm to melodies that continue to inspire the world. A lament song that waits for the Lord and us to respond in their song 40. Themes of waiting on the Lord and the desire to sing a new song, poetically and performatively, bring the psalm to life in an informed, imaginative way, haunted by the wars that raged around the globe in the early 1980s. And I imagine this relates in so many ways to our current context as well. Through informed imagination of narratives to honest poetic outbursts of praise and lament, this seed, Hesed, communicates dynamic, open-ended, and relational attributes. What is previously demonstrated with Hesed throughout the Old Testament continues to emerge throughout the Psalms. Hesed is experienced as expected and unexpected kindness and forgiveness offered, and also that Hesed is a key attribute revealed through the Lord's name, that self-disclosure, and through the Lord's demonstrations of Hesed. For a people who have experienced the trauma of exile, Hesed is a dynamic, multivalent foundation of relationship. It is rooted in God's very nature and embedded in God's previous acts, and this embedded seed produces generous hospitality and hope. So as we consider the possibilities of relationships in our modern neighborhoods and around the world, my prayer is for us to continue to lean into these ancient stories as we wait and we pray and we sing the Psalms, and as we hope with informed imaginations that include the whole story, all the plot twists of Hesed, and to work toward a future where we are all invited to participate in, to bring about the vision of peace, faithfulness, and flourishing for all. Thank you. Should I go down? Okay, thanks.
Let me begin by thanking Dr. Matheny for her wonderful and captivating conversation this evening and also yesterday evening about the theology of the Old Testament and the function of this fascinating little word, Hesed. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Colin Taufmeyer. I'm professor of Old Testament here at Ambrose University, and I'm the official respondent to the paper this evening. So yesterday evening, we were blessed to hear Dr. Matheny discuss the book of Judges and the book of Ruth, and this evening, her work focused first on Exodus, on portions of Exodus, but especially on the Psalms, praise and lament in the Psalms. And in my very brief response, I'd like to consider 2 points that relate explicitly to this second talk this evening, and then 2 points that relate to the larger project that she's arguing for and that encompass both yesterday's lecture and this evening's lecture. So let me begin with the concept of honesty and the Psalms. And this first point is really more of an observation and an affirmation than it is a question. Dr. Matheny has explored the question of honesty in the Psalms, the ways in which people from the ancient Israelites to modern poets like Bono latch on to the intensely honest articulations of emotional experiences like joy and suffering and thanksgiving in the poetry of the book of Psalms. Honesty of the sort that we find in these songs requires profound trust. We are much more likely to be truthful with people whom we trust because we can have confidence that what we say will be heard, even if it is painful or upsetting or leads to pain and to upsetting conversations. Jenny noted that the confidence in God and the absence of layers of mediation between the human person and God are the distinct features of Israel's poetic theology. The psalmists trust that they can speak to their God directly and say true things, and they believe that they can do this without human or angelic mediation. This confidence, grounded in trust, is what enables the psalmists to tell the stories that Jenny noted, including the terrible stories that we find in some psalms, like the story of the golden calf, reiterated from Exodus. It is this trust and the consequent ability to recall the past truthfully that creates the ground for present hope that is found in several of the psalms that we considered this evening. As Dr. Matheny noted, confidence in the acts of God in the past leads the psalmist to expect God's faithfulness in the future. But this expectation, and this is, I think, a very important insight, this expectation is not merely grounded in the consistency of God's behavior, it is grounded in God's very nature, in the nature of God's character. God's behavior flows from God's character. God's relationship with the people of God is, because of God's character, indissoluble. It cannot be destroyed. It cannot be removed, even by acts of unfaithfulness on the part of the people, because, as Jenny noted, Hesed is the key feature of God's unchanging character. This is the famous character credo from Exodus chapter 34. This creates the grounds for the trust that is required for these honest expressions of relationship like lament or worship or joy or thanksgiving that we find in the Psalms. This also creates the grounds for the trust required for any covenant relationship. So covenant relationality itself, which we have often thought is like the key idea of the Old Testament, it flows out of this foundation in God's character, in God's chesed. So, secondly, the Psalms and story. The question of the Psalms and stories. In her lecture this evening, Dr. Matheny has outlined for us the ways in which the poetry of the Psalter connects to story and even embodies stories. She focused particularly on the ways in which these stories, the stories of Israel, are referenced and reframed in the context of Israel's poetic liturgical life. Various psalms recall events from the history of the people of Israel and frame these events in the context of God's chesed, or the required chesed of the people. In this sense, story is incorporated into the songs of Israel. But this leads to my first question. It has become common in recent psalm scholarship to give focused attention to the overall shape of the book of Psalms, not just to individual psalms. And while there may not be total consensus about exactly how the book is shaped or how it functions, most scholars who explore this canonical shaping to the Psalter focus their attention on an unfolding story. a story told by placing certain kinds of poems about certain topics into the series that we have in the collection of 150 canonical psalms in the Hebrew Bible. Particular notice is usually given, and Dr. Matheny did hint at this a little bit in her talk, to the relationship between these 5 principal sections that we call the books of the Psalter. The book of Psalms is divided into 5 sub-books, for those who don't know this. I know Jenny knows this, I know that. By means of these stylized phrases at the end of Psalms 41, 72, 89, 106, and the final Psalm, Psalm 150. And interestingly, a quick look at the density of the use of Hesed, and we saw this in one of Dr. Matheny's slides, the density of the use of Hesed in the Psalm shows that the term is used a bunch at the beginning, but then there's a big gap, and then when we get to book 5, we have this massive preponderance of the use of Hesed. As you go further and deeper into the book, into possibly the story of the book of Psalms, we find this preponderance of the use of Hesed. And so this brings me to my question. Does a canonical analysis of the entire book of Psalms as a kind of poetic narrative about the history of Israel's relationship with God, does this serve to support those more specific arguments that you've made about the internal stories that specific individual Psalms are telling? Number 3. Minority texts for major theology. As Dr. Matheny has noted during her lectures, it isn't particularly common for biblical theologians to start their work with the book of Ruth. This is a little out of the ordinary. We don't really do this. In fact, I'm not sure anybody has ever done it. Has anybody? I don't know of anybody who's ever done it before. So, but even similarly, it's actually kind of strange to start with the book of Psalms. There are people who certainly address the book of Psalms, and if you're going to write a biblical theology, you have to address the book of Psalms. Perhaps somewhere someone has attempted to begin with the book of Psalms, but actually I can't, again, think of a particular example. In both cases, however, making use of texts that are not normally thought to represent the quote-unquote core of Old Testament theology in order to articulate this kern, this seed, this nucleus idea of Hesed, is a really interesting decision, a really interesting move to make here. And additionally, Ruth and the Psalms, at least the final form of the Psalter, and this is an interesting part of this for me, are very likely late compositions that are found in the 3rd collection, the final collection, in the Hebrew canon that we call the writings. The Old Testament's organized a little bit differently in the Hebrew canon. Now, please don't hear this as a criticism of Dr. Matheny's argument. In fact, I think that it's important and, in fact, perhaps quite revelatory as an insight for understanding the Old Testament as a coherent collection of theological writing. Does this perhaps suggest that with books like Ruth and the Psalms, we see later writers and editors drawing out this important idea of Hesed, which is undoubtedly present, but may not have had the prominence that we see now in these books, and that they are consequently rereading older stories into a new story of Israel. This new story seems to me to be especially a post-exilic story, a story for a people who have experienced the terror and the trauma and the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile, and are doing the work of reforming and rearticulating their faith in their God on the other side of that destruction and pain. And so my question here is it possible that traditional biblical theologians have had things backwards, looking for a core origin from which all Old Testament theology grew, instead of imagining a later rearticulation and reimagination of Israel's history through the lens of this kernel, this idea of Hesed that is not developed later, but emphasized later? And then finally, a 4th comment and question, the forest of themes. This leads to my 4th question, or set of questions. I'm trying to limit myself here, but it's hard. This flows not only from this evening's lecture, but from this larger project that Dr. Matheny has described for us. She's argued for us that the biblical concept of Hesed forms a kern or a kernel, a seed, the nucleus of a way of understanding the theology of the Old Testament in a larger sense. Now, this is some inside baseball. Many of you may not know this, but one of the great obsessions of Old Testament scholars like us in the modern period has been this attempt to find and describe the heart, the core, the key concept that unifies the Old Testament. Jenny described this search a little bit in her first lecture. But if you haven't seen a bookshelf full of Old Testament theologies, each of them about like 4 or 5 inches thick, it's really hard to imagine how deep this obsession runs in us. But wisely, I think Jenny has not argued that Hesed is the singular theme, or even maybe the primary theme of the Old Testament. Her metaphor of a seed that grows into a great tree, or a plant that's, I'm extending her metaphor a bit here, a plant that stretches out and makes contact with most of the Old Testament, and that is vitally of consequence then for an understanding of many other ideas and themes in the Old Testament, like, just as a couple of examples, law and covenant that we've discussed. This is very helpful, I think. This is a very interesting metaphor. It suggests to me that this organic metaphor might actually be extended. Maybe we can go farther with this metaphor. We might imagine, instead of a complex organic environment like a tree, an even more complex organic environment like a forest. In the forest, there are many varied trees, shrubs, and vines, and they are all growing together in complex ways, creating an ecosystem of interdependence, sometimes even an ecosystem of competition. And this ecosystem might provide the environment in which the faith of Israel, and then the faith of the Jews, and then the faith of the earliest Christians is fed and grows and begins to flourish as these various religious movements. And so my questions here are, first, whether or not such an extension of this Kern metaphor is viable or helpful. Are you willing to, let me push the metaphor a bit? And second, what other seeds have grown, which other plants and which other trees that twine together with Hesed to give the people of God the language for their interaction and their engagement with God? Again, thank you, Jenny, so much for your engaging, imaginative, thoughtful work. Thank you for allowing us to share with you this way of imagining God's character in the Old Testament. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh, yes.
Grab that.
Thank you, Dr. Toffelmeyer. I'm really grateful for your thoughts, your questions. And I know, starting with the book of Ruth and the Psalms is different, but when you're thinking about canon formation, and from the perspective of exile and beyond, what was important for those communities? What were the texts that they would gravitate towards as they're forming who they are in this complex space and this space of trauma? And that's where I know the work of Stephen Chapman has been helpful, because often we think of the Torah as okay, those first 5 books are the Pentateuch, they're important, but what about the writings? What about wisdom? What about, right? There's actually so many important things about these texts that I don't think are often paid enough attention to in biblical studies and in Old Testament theologies. And so I think there's something very important to do there. I know in a lot of the work that I do, we also talk about, read that text from the perspective of exile, and it adds a whole nother shape to understanding some of those core texts and those key texts. So I think that is, something I'm really thankful for. I appreciate your pushing the metaphor out. Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that I have appreciated thinking about this idea of seed, is just that there's no end to the possibilities. If it is rooted in the very nature of who God is, in that credo formula, so if it is bound up in who God is and imagined through our imago Dei as earth and people keepers, I just think there is limitless imaginative possibilities of where this can go. So rather than, these really constrictive images or centers that pull in, and I know that one of the things that I appreciate about this desire to find a center, a theme, is we're trying to comprehend such a vast amount of material. But again, as I've sat with it, I want something that moves out. And so I really do appreciate how you have brought to the idea of, thinking about not even just a plant, right, or a seed, but forests and how ecosystems might thrive and work. And so I think that is actually a really helpful way to think about that. And so I appreciate that as well. And yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done here. And so yeah, I'm hoping to just kind of get this started in hopefully a little bit of a different way, and then see what rolls out from there, and continue to engage with that as well. And so I know I probably missed some of your questions. They're so good, and I appreciate your encouragement in this work that I'm doing. And it's definitely a heart project of mine, and I'm just so excited to get some time. And in the book that will be coming out, I actually traced it through the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And so I'm trying to do, like a whole work with certain case studies to really try to get that, kind of how to think about that well within those texts. And it amazes me how often that golden calf story is brought up in Chronicles, and right, like in all of these moments that they bring that story up. And I know into the New Testament as well, right? So I think there's something about honesty, lament, and imagining a future, and the whole story is part of our story, right? And I think that has really powerful implications for things that we're processing in modern day, that we don't want to just ignore the traumas of the past or difficult parts of the story, but we can be honest and ask for forgiveness, and to move forward, and hopefully to envision a new future that could be so much better. So anyways, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matheny. I'm going to refrain from just talking to you about this, because we could just talk up here for a bit, but that's probably not helpful for everybody else. So we do have some time for questions right now, and I believe Dr. Lowe has a microphone he's going to wander around with back there. And so if you have a question or a comment you'd like to make, please just put up your hand, and Dr. Lowe will find you, and we'll go from there. As we're looking, keep looking for questions there, John. As we're looking, I was just going to say, Jenny, one of the things I'm excited about this project and about your talks with us tonight is it feels to me, and maybe I'm being too hopeful, but it feels to me like we're in the beginnings of perhaps a new movement in Old Testament and biblical theology, where we have this openness to these slightly more flexible, but still creative and imaginative ways of thinking about the text to move forward into so I'm excited. I think that you and other people are starting to move us in that direction.
Oh, yeah.
We do have a question over there now, I think.
No, that's great.
All right, thanks. That was awesome tonight, especially the Britney Spears, really good. This is maybe less of a question and more of a request for an encore, but last night you mentioned Lamentations 3, and I was sort of hoping you'd get into it, but it's been a really meaningful passage for me, and I lost my Hebrew after about 5 minutes after I passed the class, so I think Hesed is in there, right?
Yes.
Okay, I guess my question is, can you explain how Hesed shows up in Lamentations 3, particularly because it seems like it's God's Hesed that is the basis for trusting God even when God gives you grief, like God is actually the cause of grief.
Yes.
And your crib story really kind of probably touched a lot of us, because I feel like I have a lot of stories where like God brought a crib. I don't really remember what they were anymore, but it feels like the accumulation of such stories helps you to trust the bitterness from God, even when it's not a crib that's provided so much as like a Johnny Cash song when you just needed it. So I just wonder if you could maybe open Lamentations 3 for us, if you just off the top of your head can maybe explain a bit of that for us.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. I appreciate that question. One of the things that is so Lamentations is a book of 5 poems, deep suffering liturgy. One of the things also is in that respite with Hesed, there's this movement of trust. And I think depending on your season of life, you might read that a little different, but the honesty of Lamentations is so powerful, because often we focus on that center passage, right? And about, your mercies are new every morning, great is your faithfulness, right? Like that is like this moment you're like, oh, but then it goes back down, right? To more lament, which I think is often, and I know those who write on Lamentations, it's more honest of working through trauma and disaster narratives. Because it's like, okay, Lord, and even as Lamentations often reflects back and says, okay, these were the blessings and cursings in Deuteronomy, and God, this is worse than what we deserve, right? It's sort of like you see the pronoun shift in that story. And so there's this moment of like, yes, we trust, But then, similar to the process of grief, it's like, I trust you, and then, oh, this is really hard, right? And so that's I think one of the powerful things about the book of Lamentations is that it often mirrors real experiences of grief and trauma, right? Where there's a window of hope and then the reality again. And even at the end, and I'm probably going a little bit on with this, but I'm really passionate about this book. The last line is a bit of a question. Will you utterly reject us forever, right? That was the worry. But as I've worked in Lamentations, and I do some work with a good friend who's a psychologist, and I've talked in Dr. Stovell's class today about acceptance and commitment therapy, and just the importance of emotions and that honesty, is that this sense of the inwardness of Lamentations, and then getting to the place at the end where you're even willing to ask a question and be open for God to respond, is actually a place of trust. Even asking a question, you are actually like, this is really hard to ask. But when you're in a deep place of grief, often you pull in, right? And you don't even want to engage or have someone talk to you, right? It's just like here. But then to be at that space of Lamentations, that final poem, and to be open, and I'm just going to move forward into this open mystery of what's next, is actually a place of continued relationship and strength, right? But even though that is a really hard question, but Lamentations, that brief respite in the middle is it's like a beautiful, right? But often we don't want to keep reading Lamentations because it is literally saying, God, you're actually worse than, and doing things worse than we imagined. And so I think that is one of the things I find so fascinating about biblical lament, is to be able to just call out to God. I don't have to introduce myself. God knows who I am, right? And to be really honest, and how important it is to name all of the emotions before God, and know, like as you were mentioning, God doesn't run away from that. God knows. God stays at the table. I think few of us have relationships that we can be that, like Bono would say, raw, honest, right? And just go for it. And so I think that is so powerful for relationship. And but that movement there is, it's so powerful in Lamentations 3. But it's interesting, to read all 5 poems. I was doing a workshop on it, and I remember, when people started to actually read the words, that you're like, ooh, like, can you say that to God? And they say it, right? So anyway, so thank you for that question,
Thanks. Any other questions? Dr. Lowe will continue to look for you. I love your image of not being willing to leave the table. I think it's such a beautiful image. And like this indissoluble relationship that God has. You have to be in relationship. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Another question out there.
Thank you, Dr. Matheny, for, again, bringing God's word to us. And as someone who has studied a lot of the biblical metaphors and is very fascinated by the way they convey truth to us, that we rely on metaphors to understand our reality more clearly. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more, and the metaphors that you see used to express Hesed in the Psalms in particular. Do you see that there's a particular grouping and kind of metaphor that gets used, maybe certain relational metaphors? Especially if, as you've argued, Hesed is an inherently relational term. Do you see that in the metaphors in which Hesed is expressed in these Psalms?
Right. Well, I know one of the ones I had mentioned, just using the familial imagery of family, which I think erupts again and again. And we see that a lot in the prophets as well, sometimes in really difficult metaphors. But I find the fascinating thing, and I know Kathleen O'Connor does a lot of work in this area, is really pulling out, because sometimes the metaphors are very offensive to us in our modern kind of mindset. We probably wouldn't choose to use some of those metaphors. But, what they're really hoping to communicate, as I know the work that you've studied, is this deep wounding. And how else can I explain this than one of the most intimate relationships we have, and then to feel that ruptured? And so often, especially when there's violent gendered imagery, it's really hard. But to try to figure out a way to describe this deep pain or this unfaithfulness or what you've done. And so I think some of that imagery, that relational imagery, is so powerful and pervasive, right? In the Psalms and in so many of the texts. And I think when we can kind of step back from the metaphor a little bit and see, oh, what's that core value that's being communicated? And it's, I want, and then also seeing that redemptive arc of homecoming. But I want you to come back to me, right? You've left, feels like a divorce, all of this, but ultimately, Israel, Judah, I want you to return to me. And so I think it's, picking up on some of those metaphors, I think is so powerful and helpful because we are meant to be in relationship. And I think it's, that's what the thing I think with Hesed and thinking about metaphor in its ways to connect emotionally in so many powerful ways. And that's what with song and poetry and art, that I think it gets to places in us that just reading a text is not gonna do, but to sing it in community, there's something beautifully healing that happens, that we're not alone with this, but we are together. And sometimes even just the melody or whatever, there's something so powerful about that. So I think that is interesting that there's so much Hesed in the Psalms, and it's, Lord, this is huge for who you are and we are, and that we can trust that moving forward in exile. But that's, I think, metaphor is so powerful, is a way to just help us to think beyond. And as some of you might, if you've done some work in trauma, often to talk about an incident just, straight is too painful. And so to think of it in a metaphor helps us to get closer and to understand what's going on. And so I think, the biblical story is so full of powerful metaphors, negative and positive in a lot of ways. So but thank you for that. I think it's a great question.
Time for a couple more questions, probably. There's a hand in the back over there.
Thank you, Dr. Jenny, for the lecture. I'm just thinking about Hesed, and one of the antonyms that was mentioned last night was violence. And thinking through Hesed and the story of Exodus, you see this really violent reaction from Yahweh after the golden calf. You see it a lot in the prophetic text. And one of the words you used for Hesed was foundational. And I'm just wondering, in this violence you see as a response of Yahweh for not keeping the covenant, how is Hesed being foundational? Some of the times people would say, oh, well, God is just moving you through this to make you a stronger person. But I feel like that's not what's going on here. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Strong emotion is seen all throughout, right? The Old Testament, and even the anger of the Lord, right? When there's broken covenant and things like that. And often that's what you would expect. And then you would expect this judgment and this, right? And all of that. And then it's so fascinating but the response is mercy, right? And one of the things I know I actually talked about earlier today in Dr. Stovall's class that I hope gets to your question, as Hesed is foundational, but the strong language and even maybe anger from God, right? When Israel messes up and all of that, is often what is being, when we have a strong emotion like anger, often there is a boundary or a core value being crossed, right? And I'm going to just kind of take it because it's on my mind today from the work we were doing. In the book of Jeremiah, there's a lot of really strong language. And in Jeremiah 6, we were talking about God being angry and telling Jeremiah, it's okay to be angry, pour it out. And you're like, oh, as a church, often we're a little hesitant with strong emotions. And some of our ecclesial contexts or family contexts or maybe places we've grown up, that is looked at as something to be nervous about, right? But what it often does is indicates to us that there's something really important to us. And of course, if anger, it can go into bad places where violence is done, but that initial feeling, no matter how strong it is often saying, actually, there's something I really value that's some boundary being crossed, a core value or something. And in the book of Jeremiah, what we end up finding out is you trace really strong language, is that it's often covenant unfaithfulness, and it has to do with the injustice of the triad, right? Not taking care of the poor, the orphan, and the widow. And so those strong emotions are actually the heart of God, is loving God and loving neighbor, right? And so anyway, so thinking about that, it is interesting. God is angry, right? to be faithful to me, I value that, but I still end up responding with Hesed. And so that is that foundational piece that I'm just amazed at Israel coming back to, right? It's like, even though we've done this, Lord, but you forgave us. And as we're moving into this new place in the future, that we don't know what's going to happen. We've lost temple, land, we're scattered. Are you still our God? Are we still your people? And we come back to the Hesed, this relationship. And so I feel like this term, it's so beautifully ambiguous, but then as you see it worked out in these specific stories and contexts, and it takes shape and gains more color, I think it ends up being this very foundational piece that often I think can be missed if we maybe focus on covenant, but then we see, well, that covenant was broken, and then there's another covenant, right? They're all very important in ways that in the ancient mind are these important relational contracts. But Hesed, there's something about that, right? That I just think continues to be so foundational within the story. So anyways, I don't know if that gets at a little bit of that foundation piece, but yeah, it is pretty powerful. It's such a relational word as well. Yeah.
I think probably time for one more. Somebody has one more question, a burning question they need to ask as we wrap up this evening.
Looks like we got it all figured out.
I guess we did. Okay, perfect. You've answered all of our questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I would like to, first, on behalf of the Faculty of Theology, I'd like to thank again the Downey family for their generous endowment that allows these lectures to take place. These lectures will happen again next year, same time, same place. Next year, we will likely be inviting somebody from the subdiscipline of pastoral or practical theology to campus, so please look forward to that. And then, of course, finally, we'd like to give a special thanks to Dr. Matheny for being here as our guest this year. So let's say thank you to her one more time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being with us tonight, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.